Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our first event to kick off our fall webinar series. My name is Melody Greaves, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council. For anyone joining today who is not familiar with us yet, the CNIC is the voice of the Canadian isotope and radiopharmaceutical sector, and we aim to increase awareness for Canada's role in the production, supply, and use of isotopes, but also to work with our members and our partners, some of which who have joined us today, to expand patient access right across the country. Today's topic for our webinar is a very timely one. We've assembled a panel of experts from the radiopharmaceutical manufacturing and development community to discuss the topic of reimbursement. For anyone who joined us at our Canadian Radiotheranostics Leaders Summit back in June, this webinar is really meant to continue some of the important conversations around reimbursement that we started at that conference. Currently in Canada, we've seen recent public approval and reimbursement for a couple of revolutionary drugs in the last few years. Most recently, with the public funding of Pluvicto at the end of last year in Ontario, and soon after we saw it approved and funded across a number of different provinces. So this was a major step forward in Canada, but there is still so much more work that needs to be done. As we've seen in the months that followed that initial reimbursement and public funding, demand for these therapies in Canada and around the world continues to rise. Since December 2024, projected to the end of this year, nearly 1,000 patients across the country will access these life-saving drugs, and that demand continues to increase. So this really is only the first step. More work is needed to ensure that more Canadian patients can publicly access these life-changing drugs as soon as they're approved by Health Canada. So today, in our webinar, we're going to be diving deeper into that. The leaders joining us today will be discussing the progress we've seen so far, some opportunities for further expansion of radiopharmaceuticals within publicly funded healthcare, and the importance of timely reimbursement for the entire manufacturing supply chain. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar and welcome our panelists today. Kevin Wong, first of all, is the Executive Director for Ontario at Novartis Canada and leads a team that is focused on partnership opportunities and innovative models that augment healthcare systems with key stakeholders in Ontario across Novartis's therapeutic areas. Wilfred Lee is a healthcare and business leader with nearly 2 decades of experience across pharmaceuticals, medical technologies, and innovative industries. He is currently the Director of Regional Market Development for Canada at Telix Pharmaceuticals, where he drives growth strategies in the rapidly evolving theranostics field. And last but not least, we've got Kadir Shubasi, who is the Director of Business Development at AtomV Global Radiopharma, and previously the parent company of AtomV, which is the Center for Probe Development and Commercialization. She currently leads a business development team that is focused on client acquisitions, partnerships, account management, as well as marketing and communications. Thank you to you all for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this insightful conversation. I'd like to kick things off today by setting the scene for our audience a little bit. So, Kevin, I'm going to come to you for this one. Could you provide a bit of an overview of the current state of radiopharmaceutical reimbursement in Canada? How do things work? Which drugs are reimbursed and in what provinces?
Thanks for having me, Melody. So I think pioneering in this space is never easy, and it has been quite a challenge. So we've got 2 products right now that have reimbursement in Canada, Lutathera, which did take some time. So not many people know that it is for neuroendocrine tumors, and it is something that we had launched quite a while ago, but it did take quite a bit of time. Most recently, you mentioned, is Pluvicto for prostate cancer. And I think that is one where we also felt that there was similar challenges that we needed to address from a healthcare system and from a Canadian perspective. And I'd say that we've had a lot of good progress given the 2. So for an overview, Lutathera is now reimbursed across the country, which is amazing for the patients with neuroendocrine tumors. And it is now primarily funded for most provinces. We have a couple that we're still having positive progress and discussions with when it comes to Pluvicto, but we're pretty happy with the progress, especially for our patients with prostate cancer. And I think that one of the things that you wanted me to highlight too is also how things work from a regulatory and a reimbursement landscape perspective. And so just taking a step back, Health Canada, as you mentioned, essentially reviews all medications, whether it be radioligand therapies, whether it be blood pressure medications that are new, based off of the safety and efficacy. So that's generally step one, and everyone recognizes that. But there's additional layers of governance that happen in Canada, which maybe not everyone is aware of. And that includes a health technology assessment, which is essentially another group within the ecosystem, Canada's drug agency, which is responsible for essentially evaluating the cost effectiveness or the value for money for certain new therapies. And that takes some time as well. And assuming that this process is positive, it then moves on to the PCPA, or the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is a negotiation body that all of the provinces had set up about 10 years ago in order to then negotiate with pharmaceutical manufacturers and developers on the best price possible. And then after that, the journey isn't over, because then each province has to determine what type of criteria or eligibility for their individual populations that require some time. And then a listing agreement is struck so that the manufacturer then is able to have reimbursement for a particular product. I'd say that the general feeling from the industry, and I look to Wilfred and Didier for their also opinions on this, is that the most significant policy barrier that sort of limits or sort of bottlenecks some of the speed is around step 2 and 3, between the actual assessment of the new medicines and the negotiation process, which I'd say that in more recent months, we've seen more positive progress where there is greater focus on this from a federal perspective as well as from the provinces themselves. But we can always say that more can be done just based off of the need. When we live in a global world where there's a lot of visibility to where access happens, where the US or other countries potentially get access to new innovative medicines, and patients look to those to try and treat some of their cancers, and it's difficult. It's difficult because this is not an easy decision and it's not an easy environment to operate in. But it becomes clear that there needs to be more thought and more focus on radiopharmaceuticals as a benefit, because this is just the tip of the iceberg on where the potential is, where there's an ability now to have more and more opportunities for patients. And we don't necessarily want it to be stymied from the beginning.
Thanks, Kevin. I think that really helps frame the conversation that we're going to dive into a little bit. So I'm going to jump ahead in our plan here. So sorry to the panelists for throwing things off the rhythm, but you started talking about barriers and what the most pressing barriers are. So I want to dive into that a little bit, because understanding what those challenges are will help us understand what could potentially be needed to overcome those barriers. So I'm going to go to Wilfred and Gadir first for your comment on this. When we're thinking about reimbursement, both for drugs and for devices, both treatment and diagnostic, how important it is for patients in the sector, what are the most significant regulatory or policy barriers that cause delay or prevent reimbursement for some of these new theranostic agents and some of the new diagnostic agents as well? And then considering from your own perspectives within the supply chain, in the past, looking at other jurisdictions, have you seen other examples of mechanisms that can help overcome some of these barriers? So Gadir, maybe I'll put you on the spot first and start things off.
Thanks, Melody. Good morning, everyone. So I can speak on behalf of a CDMO or manufacturer perspective, and obviously, speaking for the value chain aspect that pertains to your question. So what I would like the audience to recognize in this very interesting topic is to keep in mind that we're talking about non-conventional pharmaceutical drugs here that have short shelf lives. We're dealing with isotopes, so time is of essence. As a manufacturer, obviously the concept of inventory for these drugs doesn't exist except for the starting materials. So we work very, very fast so that we can get those drugs manufactured right first time and to arrive to patients to be injected. The value chain, in my opinion, in the radiopharmaceutical industry, everything has to work right. And it's one of the very unique niche-driven industries where, one step leads to the other. And, if one thing gets thrown off, any delay in, take, for example, starting from receiving the isotope, which is our kickoff step, let's say, obviously a lot of preparation and staging has to happen before, up until the point where we get the dose out to be delivered to the patient. It's a clock ticking, right? And we have to work very fast. What is involved to make that successful are a number of factors. Number one, obviously, is a very talented skill set that we have, to recruit, to train, and to retain. So these are people who are, they're our asset, and they're obviously not easy to find. So to get that workforce up and running and to have them, manufacture those drugs, as different teams are involved here, right? So, from production to quality to logistics, and that logistics and supply chain aspect, that's a very, as you know, complex process that has to go right, so that we get success in reaching the patient. So that's a big factor for us is our talent and our workforce. And obviously, for us, having infrastructure, functional, operational, compliant, right? So obviously dealing with GMP compliance and having the proper, regulatory by having drug establishment license, and also in this field, it's not just GMP, so there's a safety aspect, right? So we have to abide by the CNSC and all the regulations that go with implementing safety in-house for our operators and to get those drugs safely injected into patients. So that's a big factor as well to consider in the manufacturing value chain. The infrastructure that we have, we are currently operating at McMaster University, and also expanding our operations into a new facility in Hamilton, because we see the need to get more of these drugs, commercially on the market within the next 5 to 10 years. So obviously the need is there for capacity. Having equipment, very specialized equipment in-house, obviously how to, operate them, how to maintain them, having engineers on site who are working 24/7, cyclotrons is just an example, but many other pieces of equipment, in-house isolators, hot cells, that need to be functional so that we can get those drugs synthesized, manufactured, quality controlled, and shipped out successfully. Obviously, so that comes all, again, everything has to work very well in place. Last but not least, and that's where I want to point is the logistics aspect is huge for us. So I always say this to our partners and clients, that you can know how to manufacture a drug, but if you don't ship it out in time, there's no use for it, because that's ultimately the goal, is to get it out to the patient. So we have thankfully a very robust logistics and supply chain, successful operations at RMV, and we know how to maneuver around getting those drugs through the borders, and internationally we reach more than 28 countries and all 6 continents. So we've managed to figure out how to master this piece of our business. Basically what I want to then maybe pass it to Wilfred, because as Telix is a drug developer, you're the ones who are in face of these reimbursement discussions, and you obviously deal with them directly. But as it impacts us as a CDMO, we're directly impacted in the sense that whatever is affecting our drug developers is affecting the need for CDMO services from us. And, maybe I'll get Wilfred to comment a bit on the aspect of your question, Melody, which is more related to the reimbursement policies. But I hope I've given you enough idea of what the manufacturing value chain aspect is, because it's a very complicated one, and it's unique to these non-conventional pharmaceutical drugs.
I've heard a phrase to say that with radiopharmaceuticals, we need to be reimbursing almost for the entire process, not just for the final pill,
Exactly.
which is a little bit different and stands out
Exactly.
from conventional pharmaceutical drugs.
Absolutely.
Wilfred, are you able to comment from the radiopharma development perspective on some of those barriers that you see from your work with Telix?
For sure. So, well, first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's a great honor to speak to you all here. So, as Gadir pointed out earlier, radiopharmaceuticals is quite different from other pharmaceuticals that normally the Health Canada or CADF or other agencies always encountered. As Melody said, this is not just a pill, manufactured from one site and delivered to the patients and help them with the cancer treatments and so forth. It requires a whole chain of operations to get to the final product. And of course, as such, as Gadir said earlier, time is the essence. It has half-life, things decay. So, I want to give a shout out to my distribution partner, Isologic, as they work with a lot, the past few years on the reimbursement from the government agencies and so forth. And I'm very fortunate to work with them on this process as well. So right now, as much as I can encounter or understanding, there's no real clear defined pathway for reimbursement for diagnostic agents. So, Kevin and his team in Novartis, because they have a ROT treatment, so it'll be a slightly different agencies. But when it comes to just purely diagnostic agency, it doesn't seem to be, or maybe I'm aware that there's a very clear pathway when it comes to reimbursement. And one thing that people have to think about is that ultimately, reimbursement is not just looking at the cost of the drug itself. They have to encounter you have to compensate for the process that it takes, the infrastructure that have to be invested, like Gadir, she mentioned, the cyclotron, the generators that is required, the workforce behind the scene that keeps the cyclotron running, the engineers behind the scene. Even, if you look at private clinics and hospitals, the infrastructure they have to be in place and the workforce they have to hire, technologists they have to hire to keep the process running. So it's a more involved process and drugs than what most people would think. It's not just a pill or a dose of products inject patients and that's it. In that particular dose, a lot of things are happening behind the scene in addition to R&D as well.
Thanks, Wilfred. So I want to keep having this conversation around the entire process and dive into that a little bit more. So, Gadir, I'll come back to you for this one in particular. When we think about that entire complex supply chain that's involved in the production of a radiopharmaceutical, whether that's on the treatment side or the diagnostic side, that evidently will require significant capital and significant investment upfront. Behind you is on your background, we see a beautiful facility that I know that AtomV is very close to unveiling, which is really exciting. But that requires significant investment to have a facility of that magnitude and that scale. So looking at our current reimbursement system, how does that create potential risk for companies that are looking to invest or looking to scale up projects in Canada?
Yeah, no, great question, Melody. And anything that affects delays of these drugs getting public approvals for these reimbursements obviously poses uncertainty for the drug developers. And these are our clients, they're our partners. They're the ones that their success basically determines our business success as well. So as you said, when we invested into this brand new state-of-the-art facility, and we went out and we raised more than $90 million of funding that is entirely dedicated to build this facility, that was with the vision that we evaluated the market of the radiopharmaceuticals, and we know that the number of radiotherapeutics and diagnostics is projected to increase in the next 5 to 10 years, meaning that capacity is required to manufacture those drugs. And if you look at what's available on the market right now, it's very limited. We're talking not just clinical, but also commercial supply, like the Pluvictos and the Lutatheras of the world. So with that vision, this is how we are basically building this new facility. So for us, it's detrimental if these, as you called it earlier, together with Kevin and Wilfred, any roadblocks, any delays, that means that the drug developers themselves will have hesitation in investing into potential capacity, which is basically what we're building this new facility with in mind. Like there's a vision here. We have a long-term vision. Obviously providing, CDMO services to support investigational products and clinical supply, but we're looking for, longer term vision. So I can tell you that the impact will be pretty detrimental on the success of our business if those roadblocks continue. I'm hopeful because I can hear from Kevin and Wilfred that there's a bit of improvement in the negotiation table. Obviously, we don't sit on those conversations, so that we're not privy to those. However, we can somehow support our drug developers. We talk about cost effectiveness of what those doses, like what does it mean? What drives the cost of these doses? And we can definitely provide that, depth of knowledge, because we know, as you said, it's the investment that we've put into this building, not just the infrastructure itself, but the equipment that we got in, the talent that we continue to attract and to, retain with us, the overhead costs, the complexity of the logistics. Don't forget also the scale of production that we are working on as well. Like these are, radiopharmaceuticals. If you get for phase 1 to 2 doses per batch, and you go up to 15 to 20 doses per batch by phase 3, and then I know the Pluvicto is definitely higher than that, but we're not talking batches that create thousands of doses, right? So that is costly as well for the drug developer and to produce, right? So I hope I convinced you that for us it's long-term success planning that depends on whether those drug developers will get those approvals in a timely manner so that they can see potential to invest into capacity, which is what we are working on very hard at AtomV. And getting more of these drugs manufactured and more the demand to drive the demand further, because we definitely see the promise of this field.
Thanks, Kadir. I really resonate with what you said at the start, that the reason why you're investing in this is because you see the promise and that you see the growth there. And we want to make sure that companies like AtomV that are investing in this space to help it grow are going to see that return on investment. And the reimbursement piece is a major part of that. Thinking about the growth, we're projecting that the market's going to reach up to 42 billion by 2033, which is an absolutely massive opportunity. So we want to make sure that Canada is poised and positioned to take advantage of that, while we're also considering what that means for patients at the other end who hope and want to have access to these life-saving drugs and devices. So when we think about the global scale, just changing the conversation a little bit, I'd like to say that we're in a bit of a time of preparation right now. We have a few drugs on the global market that are really promising, that are really leading the way, but we also see dozens of drugs that are in the clinical trial pipeline right now that will be emerging in the next couple of years. And we hope to see that many of those will be quickly approved in Canada by Health Canada as well. So given that we're kind of in a state where we can prepare for that influx of drugs, how can Canada prepare for that upcoming demand by looking at some of the previous reimbursement decisions that we've gone through? What lessons have we learned? How have we navigated some of those conversations in the past? and hopefully how can that shape efforts. So Kevin, I'll go to you for this one as kind of the more recent procedures with Pluvicto.
Yeah, a lot of great lessons. I think summing up what Yadir and Wilfred had said, I think one of the things that we learned in our journey was that education was definitely key amongst stakeholders and decision makers. And what one anecdote that came to mind in having a conversation with a decision maker was that they had viewed Pluvicto as simply another university textbook, where sure, the cost of the production is low, but the value is in the intellectual property or the content. But to Gadir's point and Wilfred's point, it's much more complex with radioligand therapies because of the production and also the post commercialization efforts. Because when it comes to getting the right dose to the right patient at the right time, there's scheduling, there's nurses, there's GPS tracking for these, there's different storage requirements and transport. Because we live in a cold climate, there are changes that we have to do for winter versus summer. So we have a summer box and a winter box. These types of activities are necessary for these, and it's challenging. And I think one of the things that we also are now much more positive about in terms of learning from it, and I think this is great from the national and provincial levels, is that we are seeing more and more focus on the nuclear industry and Canada's global leadership on not just energy production, but also on medical isotopes in general. And I think that with those national strategies in place and the support, the provinces are also recognizing that there is value in accelerating. And we're seeing strong leadership from Ontario and the announcement of an accelerated access pathway, and that they're developing this on their own, and with a lot of conversations, though, with some of their provincial counterparts. And those provincial counterparts are also having those types of conversations. And so I think we're at a really good spot, like you mentioned, Melody, about preparation. I think Canada is starting to prepare to be another global leader. And it goes back to our history, our strong and proud Canadian history with Chalk River and some of the other activities that we had done in the nuclear space, and bringing it back and stronger than ever.
Thanks, Kevin. We certainly have a very long, proud history in this space, and continuing that is a major priority for us, as it is, I'm sure, for many in the industry. Wilfred, I'm wondering if you could comment on this. Telix globally seems to have a press release going out about some clinical trial every couple of days. We follow you guys on LinkedIn, and there's always stuff that you're putting out about ongoing progress with trials. Right. And that's across a number of different applications. There's lots on very hard to treat cancers, things like glioblastoma, cancers that otherwise wouldn't have many other options. So in terms of helping Canada prepare to welcome and to accept these drugs and really build that into the way we treat and diagnose cancers, what do you see as some of the ways that we can prepare and lessons learned from the past?
Oh, for sure. So, we thank you for following us. And we have a lot of trials going on, from diagnostic clear cell renal cell carcinoma for kidney cancers to glioblastoma for brain tumor. We also have treatments, global study right now for prostate cancer as well. And we're using, a lot of new technologies that potentially, I believe that, even FDA or Health Canada haven't really encountered before, or when they go through the documentation, they're like, wow, it's the expertise they need in order to understand how the product works. So, a couple of things that as Canada can be prepared for is to be ready for the new technologies. Don't be like, it's not the old way of molecules anymore. We are antibody based now. Do we understand how that works? It's a complexity as well, because we will use different from radioactive tracers. Like we're looking at zirconium for renal cell carcinoma. So do we understand that, how that works, or how is that being extracted from cyclotron? So a lot of that has to be done and prepared. One thing that I want to point out is that is the way the fund the system within the hospital as well. I think that Ontario is doing a great job in terms of having a CCO, Cancer Care Ontario, to separately looking at the diagnostic and therapy portion for cancer treatments. But other provinces, sometimes they have to have a global funding for let's say a particular for gallium PSMA scan. So something to keep in mind that with new approved drugs and once they get reimbursed, um, the cost is there, and they might have to look into having a separate funding to make sure that those new procedures for diagnosing or treatment in the future are well funded. Because a lot of times, imagine you're running a hospital with X dollars, running your current procedures right now, but if new procedures come out, is X plus Y. Where's that Y dollar coming from? So it's the way that federal and provincial governments can start thinking about like, working closely with industry partners like Novartis and ourselves in Telix. Hey, if a potential new drugs coming along, how many patients will benefit? What are we looking at? So if we can work very closely together, that'd be great. And the biggest obstacle I'm sure Kevin and his team at Novartis encountered before was the time for reimbursement. From a drug being Health Canada approved to reimbursement, that's always a question mark, and that's always a question mark from every standpoint, from drug developer as well, because once we have to invest quite a significant amount of money into getting a drug approved in the country, and a lot of times they will ask the questions, well, how long do you think it takes to recapture the investment? And that's always the question mark, and say, well, really depending on the funding and reimbursement strategy. So it's just something that we as vendors are very happy to discuss with the government in the future when we bring a product to the marketplace, how we can help the patients, and how do we have a strategy to able to reimburse and cover the cost.
Thanks, Wilfred. So you started a bit of a conversation on some of the potential routes that we can take this and some of the options to work a little bit closer with government. So I want to continue that, and I want to open it up to everyone to have a comment on this, because I think recognizing your unique perspectives on it, I think everyone will take a bit of a different approach to this. But from your own personal experience going through some of these processes, and your understanding of some of the possible levers, we'll call it, within government that we could potentially pull on, or what policy mechanisms, what are some of the levers that we can pull within the Canadian government, or Canadian reimbursement pathways, or even on the provincial funding pathways, that we could be able to fast track the approval and the funding of some of these agents? So maybe I'll go to Kevin first for this one.
It's a great question, Melody. I think two things really come to mind for us at Novartis is that one is the modernization of how we assess these medications. That's an ongoing process, and there's been great leaps and bounds with Canada's drug agency. I think one of the things that is key, though, is like when I mentioned the intellectual property and the textbook, but not recognizing that there is broader economic considerations. Because if strategically as a country we are going to go and double down on nuclear energy, then that should be considered as part of the reasoning or the assessment as Canada's drug agency, as one piece of the nuclear industry in making decisions on or recommendations for radioligand therapies. The other is around accelerating the time to listing or the reimbursement, like Wilfred had mentioned, is that historically these have been sequential. So Health Canada, when I mentioned in the beginning, Health Canada goes first, then CDA, then PCPA, and it has been a very, let's say, sequential process, run right after the other, and never should the two overlap. What we're seeing more around the modernization of this, in Ontario has highlighted this with their accelerated access pathway, is what if we could start sooner rather than later, but let's put in some safeguards. Let's look at specific areas like oncology products, with Project Orbis being a joint country review of oncology products that the government of Ontario has highlighted as their focus. And then the other piece to it too is making sure that it is risk shared, so that if the manufacturer believes there's value for money, and as a Canadian as well, I want to ensure that our tax dollars go to medicines that work. And so if there's a risk-sharing element up front that both the manufacturer and the provincial governments agree to, then there is a way to manage that risk and that uncertainty. And that gives better predictability to all of the other adjacent industries like Adir and Adamli and others that are supporting this overall industry in nuclear as well as in medicine. And that would help improve Canada's just productivity and output, as well as just treat the patients that truly need these medicines.
Thanks, Kevin. Gadir, do you want to chime in from a facility perspective in terms of, from your perspective, potential policy mechanisms that can accelerate things like commercialization and things like new facilities and encourage investment in the space?
Yeah, no, great question, Melody. And I think Kevin covered it nicely from a drug developer perspective. From a manufacturing perspective, it would be really supportive once we start seeking government support, and we obviously look upon agencies like Invest Ontario, IROC, and Export for funding opportunities to continue fueling the success of our business. We've been successful. It's just that sometimes we do struggle with sort of the pace, and as Kevin said, the sequence of events, and sometimes the timing, of how long it takes for us to get those applications put in, reviewed, approved, and getting the funding, which is basically what we need so that we can continue, supporting the programs that we have, and having already, a good amount of investment secured. And for that, we went to U.S. investors, Avigo, and that's another story that we can maybe have another webinar on that one day. Like having Canadian businesses being supported by Canadian investors is something, is a topic that we could discuss at length. But focusing on the government, to your question, really would love the agencies to just give the Canadian businesses that have a good story to tell, because we do, and have a lot of potential to succeed. And ultimately, as Kevin and Wilfred and CNIC and everyone on this call knows, it's the patient at the other end. That's the end user. And we're trying to get to as many patients with getting those drugs manufactured and delivered in Canada and across the globe. So the more successful we are in getting the funding we need, the more outreach we will get to. And that's the mission that we're all in my opinion, is just keeping in mind that it's a patient's life that you're transforming on the other side.
Thanks, Gadir. I think that last comment, that's the most important part to keep in mind, is certainly central to what we're trying to do, and ensuring that patients first and foremost are getting access to a drug that could potentially revolutionize the way that they're diagnosed or treated, which could have significant impacts on their lives and their families' lives, and get them back to their lives as quickly as possible. Before I turn it over to Wilfred for comment on that last question, just a reminder to anyone who's joined us today that there is an opportunity to drop questions into the chat below. If you have anything that you'd like to ask the panelists, we'll keep an eye on that and see if we can work it into the conversation. But Wilfred, I'll turn it over to you on that last question.
For sure. So, Kevin and Gadir brought some really good points to how can we be prepared and sped up the process. And one thing that I want to add is that, because we have National Pharmacare program for diabetes and for contraceptions across Canada. I'm just thinking that, why don't we have this for diagnostic agents as well? Because ultimately we don't want to say, hey, you know what, I'm lucky enough to be residing in Toronto or Quebec, so we will get this particular drug reimbursed and covered before the folks in, let's say, PI or East Coast or West Coast or Saskatchewan. We as Canadian, we have to look at, the new development. We all contribute tax money for the whole ecosystem. I think that as Canadian, we should all benefit from West Coast to East Coast. No one should be left behind because of where they live. I know that PET cameras are very limited in terms of where they are across the country, but at the same time, if it's available, I think that we should look into some sort of a national or federal negotiations that once the product is ready, will be a national across that everyone will have access to the product, not just one province start, the next province will follow. Because if you think about it, cancer patients are being diagnosed every single day, and there are a lot of cancer patients passed away every single day as well. So if they're able to find, find a cancer, issues earlier, they can get treated earlier, and more patients will be safe, and less suffering will happen. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I think that is a really valuable perspective to bring into this, that when we're talking about access, it's not just access in the big city centers, but it's access equitably across the country. And considering maybe that is a webinar that we do in the future to build on this conversation even further of once things are reimbursed and once they're publicly funded, how do we make sure that patients, no matter where they live, have access? Because to your point, it shouldn't matter what your postal code is to determine whether or not you're going to have access to a treatment or a diagnostic agent like this. So thinking about this conversation on potential policy levers and potential solutions to overcome different challenges, we talked about how we're in a period of preparation right now. So while we're thinking about how to potentially improve some of our reimbursement pathways, some of our approval mechanisms, what are the short-term, more immediate mechanisms that might be available to us? Things like compassionate use, bridge funding, other different special access programs that exist across the country that might be able to bring access to patients while we're still allowing our system to catch up. So maybe I'll go to Wilfred first on this one and then over to Kevin.
Yeah, so I mean the bridge funding or special access, those are very great ways to bring in new innovations or novelty drugs to the hospitals for key physicians who are willing to try it out. We have, as I mentioned before, we have products in our pipeline that a lot of physicians actually have inquired with me about, and they're very interested in obtaining. Say, hey, you know what? I want to bring this into my department. I can think about 4 or 5 patients that can benefit from this scan already. But at the same time, it's just this is more than just a pill. It's a lot of logistic as well. So we need our CDMOs, to make sure that we can coordinate and bring it in. There are a lot of hoops and obstacles that we have to encounter along the way. If you think about a drug or radioactive product that's produced from outside Canada, bringing to Canada, the process that is involved will be tremendous. And once it passes the border, and as Kadir mentioned before, time is of essence as well with radioactive products. How fast can we bring to the hospitals? And in addition to that, the CNSC license, they have to change, maybe audit on the change on the CNSC license because it's a new tracers that they haven't used before. So go back to your question. So yeah, so compassionate use or special access to tracers are very differently important. Now, at the same time, those products that come in, as I mentioned, the whole process, it's not going to be cheap. How much will that, how much are they going to be covered in terms of those costs, even at a research stage or clinical trial stage? We just have to make sure ultimately we want to benefit the patients with the special access to the product. At the same time, we have to make sure that logistically and ultimately we capture the cost of the products coming into the country as well.
And Kevin, do you want to jump in and provide your perspective on that one?
Alfred did a great summary. I'd say that the other piece is just to tell the jurisdictions, and if I could, the provinces, is not to wait. I think that we all recognize that these are beneficial medicines for patients, and that with Ontario leading the way, other provinces are also interested. And so spreading the program for risk sharing, on being able to tell manufacturers and tell the industry that there is certainty in that we are, as a country, looking to improve our standing as a global nuclear powerhouse, then let's make sure that all of the rowers are rowing in the right direction. So let's make sure that the jurisdictions, the provinces, are all focused on providing early access at a risk sharing. Like, I recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty on their side from a budgetary perspective as well, but making it a sound decision on risk sharing and starting somewhere so that we can at least see and evaluate and reassess and be able to have these medicines early in the hands of physicians who need to use these for the treatment of different myriads and different types of cancers. And so I think that's where the short term is very readily available on just ensuring others are also a part of the dialogue and action.
Thanks, Kevin. We do have a question that's been dropped into the chat. So perhaps the first piece of this, I'll turn to you, Kevin, right away. How can we effectively educate Canada's Drug Agency and PCPA on the complexities of manufacturing, logistics, and commercialization? And then maybe this second part I'll go to Gadir with. Do you think a collective unified approach would be the most effective way to ensure these nuances are clearly understood? Perhaps to your point about the industry or the supply chain being prepared to support some of that data collection and the market data to strengthen the case for coverage. So Kevin, we'll start with you.
I'd say that we're on the right track. To be honest, I think one of the greatest things that's happened is a lot of the advocacy that comes from CNIC and from the member companies. And the Leadership Summit, and being its second year, I hope it continues for 30 more years, because those are the types of events that when you invite other stakeholders that aren't necessarily familiar with key elements of an industry or key elements of drug development and manufacturing, I'll need to have that visibility or need to have that understanding. And so those sessions and those connections with the CDA and the PCPA and more dialogue with clinicians and the industry are needed. And I think that we're on the right track. And I mean, this is unfortunately, but the truth is that we can always do better. It's just we don't have enough time or people or resources. But I'd say that we definitely can continue on this track, and it's just the beginning.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that you mentioned the summit. That is really a primary goal of the summit, of bringing everyone together to talk about these things and find the best path forward. I'm happy to let you know that the summit will continue to be happening. We have selected our dates for next year, so everyone on the call, please save the dates of May 25 and 26. Of next year, it'll be in Toronto again, and there'll be more information coming out soon, but we certainly will be building on these conversations in forums like that in the future. And then Gadir, I'll go to you for the second part of that about potential approaches for industry and the sector to support some of that data collection.
Yeah, thanks, Melody. And it's definitely a question that I connect with, and I concur with everything Kevin said and echo him when he mentioned education earlier in the webinar. So I think education is a big component, and it seems like having manufacturers be part of the discussions while reimbursement sort of conversations take place seems to be key, because then they need to understand the complexity of what we do. And I do think that having that holistic approach and presenting the whole value chain, as we explained earlier today, I think that'll be valuable for them, because maybe that'll shed light into the fact that these are really unique drugs and require a lot more, as you mentioned, I think earlier, behind the scenes work. So the skill set that you need to get those drugs. And we've hosted some patient-centric sessions lately at RMV, where we've invited sponsors, plus sometimes even patients. And when they listen to what goes on behind closed doors, they're really fascinated, because I guess, yeah, they know that they receive a drug and it's radioactively labeled and it has to be injected in a particular safe manner, but the steps that go into it, I think we really need to voice it more and be, as Kevin and Wilfred said, be part of the earlier conversations, because hopefully that'll help with convincing, having the early access argument go forward.
Thanks, Gadir. And Wilfred, I'm going to come to you. There's a couple more questions that have been dropped into the Q&A, so I'll put you on the spot with these. When thinking about all of the different players that are involved in these early conversations about sort of encapsulating the value of these types of products, what role do patient advocacy groups play in influencing some of these reimbursement outcomes? And what role do you envision hospitals playing specifically? I know you talked about the role of hospitals a little bit in your previous answer to one of the other questions, but specifically, what role can they and physicians play in helping to communicate the value and to collect some of the data on the value that these bring to patients?
Well, that's a very good question because actually I was thinking about, for the previous question about patient advocacy group as well. We work very closely with different patient advocacy group across Canada. We have advocacy specialists to deal with the team as well. When patients are more educated, they will be able to say, hey, you know what? When I have this particular cancer issues, what would be the best diagnosis that I can have? What's available in the marketplace, what's being reimbursed and covered at this point. So we did a presentation for Prostate Canada group talking about gallium PSMA scans. What value does it bring to them? So with patient advocacy group, they're able to see, hey, you know what, if I have this cancer, maybe I can discuss it with my doctor, say, hey, you know what, do you think this scan will be helpful for diagnosis? Now, for future drug development, we as I mentioned before, we have a product for clear cell renal cell carcinoma, so there'll be kidney cancer group. So, we are working closely with them as well to say, hey, you know what, if a patient comes across ccRCC, what is the current method of diagnosing them right now, and what's the current treatment? Now, with our new product, how does that look? How does that change the treatment management? Because a lot of times, there are complications that comes with it. People say, well, the cost of diagnostic is whatever X dollars, but they have to look at the complications in the future. If you're a patient, they take your kidney out, your lifestyle, the time that you stay in ICU costs a lot more than that's the procedure of diagnostic itself. So we have to look at the whole ecosystem in terms of the cost management. And how the physician comes into play in the new product development is that similar to what I just said earlier, they have to look at the cost of the system. So if there's a new product that can help them to make better diagnosis, better treatment plan for the patient, ultimately doing patient better goods, if that will save our healthcare system a lot more money than they ever envisioned, so if we have to get a better education to, the government and the physicians. And I have to say, CNIC team, bring us a very good platform to able to get in touch with the government agency because traditionally, pharmaceutical companies are focused a lot on educated physicians, but ultimately we have to also educate the ministries and the government agency to get them to understand what is nuclear medicine, what is PET agents, because as Gadir mentioned before, we are very different. We're not just a pill, it's a whole system behind it to make it work. So it's great for them to understand what we do behind the scene as well.
Thanks, Wilfred. Just looking at our time, I think I'll give everyone kind of one rapid fire question to end things off. So when we look at the next 12 to 18 months, let's say, what actions can we take as industry, as the sector, working in collaboration with some of those healthcare partners, some of the patient advocacy groups, and working with government? What can we take in the short term to move us closer to that scalable, ideal reimbursement model for radiopharmaceuticals that we've been talking about? So maybe Kevin, I'll go to you first, then over to Gadir, and then Wilfred can have the last word of the day.
Great, Melly. I'd say that creating that early access program across the country, because we don't want inequity for any patients. Like, it shouldn't be where if you're living in British Columbia or you're living in Nova Scotia, that you have different accesses to different medicines for oncology or for even any other medicines for that matter. I know it's challenging because of budgets and restraint, but really working with governments, validating that they're on the right track and supporting them on their ability to create these early access programs, I would say the key to making sure that we create the access that we need for our patients and also for creating more certainty so that the industry can really move forward and progress on where our ambition as a country lie.
Gadir, over to you.
Thanks, Melody. Again, working with our partners, our drug developers, I would say being involved in the discussions earlier with them, educating the government bodies on what we do. So I know the CNIC does an excellent job in being active in the lobbying side of things. So having manufacturers being part of that, in my opinion, is valuable, because the number of times that we discussed with government officials what we do, it's that you shed light on things that they probably were not aware of. So I think we need to continue with as many of these initiatives as we can. Having data on the cost effectiveness of these drugs. I mean, we can certainly also be part of those discussions, so that we can help, as Kevin and Wilfred say, early access, proceed forward. And yeah, ultimately just really convincing the government to provide us with as much support with funding opportunities, so that we can continue to operate our businesses in a healthy manner and keep our talent here, not go anywhere, right? That's job creation is a big mandate for us, and hopefully we'll get that support as well. And again, just trying to get as many of those drugs manufactured to reach as many Canadian and patients worldwide. So.
Thanks, Idir. And I appreciate the mention of talent retention too. That's a topic we didn't even dip our toes into today, but maybe another webinar in the future. Wilfred, no pressure, but over to you for the last word.
Oh, for sure. They always say save the best for last, right? No, kidding aside, I do echo what Kevin said as well. Have early special access programs and funding for novelty drugs coming into the market, and get the physicians to able to see, does this new novelty drug actually helpful for their diagnosis and patient management. Ultimately, we are in this business to help patients to diagnose and cure cancer if that's what we can do for them. And one thing that I might also suggest is that in the short term, I know it's a little bit challenging right now in the short term, but have a separate funding for cancer or diagnostic drugs, because as I said earlier, CCO is doing a great job in Ontario. Have a separate funding for that, but it doesn't apply to other provinces across the country. Running, a new novelty drugs through a global fund is quite challenging. Consider that global fund supposed to run their own departments in a day-to-day manner. So if government agency can say, look at a separate funding for diagnostic drugs or cancer therapy drugs, that'll be great. That's what I'll be thinking about as well.
Thanks, Wilfred. Looking at the time, I just want to take a quick second to thank our panelists for such an engaging discussion this morning. I think we could certainly keep this conversation going for hours, but I think that really does speak to how truly important this is. As was mentioned earlier, Canada has been a major global player in isotope research, development, and production for many decades now. And we want our patients to have timely access to things that are made here, both the isotopes and the final drugs and devices. We also want to make sure that the companies have certainty that return on investment in Canada is there. And all of that will help to grow the sector as we continue to push towards our goal of doubling isotope production by 2030, but also to broaden access right across the country, regardless of where patients live. Before I let everyone go today, a few announcements and upcoming events to add to your calendars. For anyone traveling to the EANM conference in a couple of weeks, the CNIC will be hosting two side sessions in the VIP room to highlight the Canadian ecosystem, including one about the CANDU infrastructure advantage and the other about our more diverse isotope ecosystem, some of which we talked about today in terms of the logistics, the transportation, the manufacturing side. All of that will be encapsulated in that session. These workshops will be held both from 1:30 to 3 p.m. on October 5 and 7. And we are also going to be having a very exciting announcement happening at these workshops, so we hope to see everyone there. At the start of today's webinar, I also mentioned that this is just the first in our fall webinar series. Up next, at the end of October, we will be celebrating the 74th anniversary of the world's first cobalt-60 external beam radiation therapy, which happened in London, Ontario in 1951. So join us for a journey through Canada's cobalt-60 supply and delivery network on October 27th at 11 a.m. If you scan the QR code that's up on your screen right now, that'll take you directly to the registration page. And lastly, as we look towards November, we are pleased to announce a new event in partnership with the Economic Club of Canada, Isotopes for Hope, Canada's 2030 Promise. This will serve as the launch event for the next phase of our Isotopes for Hope campaign, so please join us for that exciting event later this fall. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists once again for sharing your expertise and your audience for joining us. This webinar, as with all of our web events, will be up on the CNIC website in the next couple of days if you'd like to rewatch or share it. Thank you again to everyone for joining, and we'll see you at our next event.